They're beating my mama. She's dying. Please, mister. Please. The entire restaurant froze. Every armed man in that room had his hand on a weapon. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence, and Gavin Carlisle, the most feared man in Chicago, sat perfectly still while a 7-year-old girl in torn clothes and bare bleeding feet gripped his sleeve with both hands and looked up at him with eyes that had already seen too much of the world's worst. She hadn't knocked. She hadn't waited. She had run straight through 2 armed guards, crossed a room full of killers, and chosen him. Out of every door in Chicago, she had chosen his. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, hit that bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me all the way to the end. You won't believe what happens next. The night was supposed to be simple. That was the word Gavin Carlisle used when he gave instructions to his driver Marco earlier that evening. Simple. A dinner, a conversation about territory lines with 2 associates who had been getting sloppy, a glass of Barolo, maybe 2, then home by 10. Gavin didn't do complicated anymore. He was 51 years old and he had been running Chicago's South Side for nearly 3 decades. He had earned the right to call things simple. But the moment he walked through the front doors of the Silver Chalice and saw the way his men immediately straightened their backs and stopped talking, he knew the evening had already decided it wasn't going to be simple. Boss, his head of security, a wide-shouldered man named Dom, leaned close as Gavin moved through the restaurant. Sal's already at the table. Tony's running 15 minutes late, he called. Of course he did, Gavin said without breaking his stride. Tony's been late to every meeting since 1974. Get him on the phone. Already tried, he's not picking up. Gavin stopped. He turned and looked at Dom. Is that a problem I need to care about tonight? Dom hesitated, which was itself the answer. Maybe. Then get someone to his apartment. Gavin kept walking. And Dom, tell the kitchen, I want the lamb, not the veal. Last time they brought me veal, and I didn't say anything, and now they think that's what I eat. Dom almost smiled. Almost. Yes, boss. The restaurant was full the way the Silver Chalice was always full on a Thursday evening. Every table occupied, soft jazz bleeding out from the corner where a trio played without anyone really listening. Men in expensive suits, women with better jewelry than the men. Conversations happening at a volume carefully calibrated to sound like nothing important was being said. Everyone in that room knew who Gavin Carlisle was, and everyone in that room was pretending they didn't. That was the arrangement. That was how Chicago worked. Gavin reached his table, the corner booth, the one with the wall on 2 sides, the one he had been sitting at for 20 years, and he lowered himself into the seat across from Sal Marchetti, who was already halfway through a bread roll and looking guilty about it. You started without me, Gavin said. The bread was right there, Sal said. You're 60 years old, Sal. 62. And you still can't wait 10 minutes for bread. Sal put the roll down on the plate with the careful dignity of a man trying not to look embarrassed. How was the drive in? Fine. Gavin unfolded his napkin. Talk to me about the Lakeview situation. And that was how the evening began. Business, territory, money moving in directions it wasn't supposed to move. Gavin listened more than he talked, the way he always did, because in his experience, the man who listened longest in any room was almost always the most dangerous one. He watched Sal's hands when Sal talked. He noted which sentences came too fast and which ones came with a pause before them. He was reading the room the way he had been reading rooms since he was 19 years old and had nothing but his instincts to keep him alive. He was halfway through his lamb, which was exactly what he had ordered because the kitchen had finally learned when the front door opened. He didn't look up. People came in and out of restaurants. That was what restaurants were for. But then one of his men near the door said something sharp and low, and Gavin heard the scrape of a chair as someone stood, and then there was a sound that didn't belong in any room Gavin had ever held a business meeting in, a child crying, not whimpering, not the polite, contained kind of crying that children sometimes do in public when their parents are nearby to manage them. This was raw, desperate. The kind of crying that comes from a place so deep that the child making it doesn't even know anymore if anyone will hear. Gavin looked up. She was standing 10 feet away, and she was the smallest, most wrecked-looking human being he had seen in a very long time. Bare feet on the restaurant floor, a dress that had been clean at some point, maybe that morning, and was now torn at the shoulder and stained with something dark that Gavin recognized immediately and felt land in his chest like a stone. There was a cut above her right eyebrow, dried blood tracking down the side of her small face, and her eyes, enormous and dark and completely devastated, were moving around the room in the frantic animal way that eyes move when someone is looking for the one thing that can save them. Two of Gavin's men were already moving toward her. Hey, kid, you can't be in here. Get her back outside." The girl didn't run. She didn't flinch. She looked at the two large men walking toward her, and she looked past them, and her eyes found Gavin Carlisle. Later, he would think about that. The way she looked past everything else. Past the men, past the room, past all the noise and the danger that a 7-year-old child should not have been able to see. She looked straight at him as if she had known exactly where he would be sitting. And then she ran, not away from his men, straight through them. She was small enough and fast enough that she got between them before they could catch her, and she crossed the restaurant in a dead sprint, dodging a waiter who barely managed to keep his tray level, and she came around the side of the corner booth and grabbed Gavin Carlisle's sleeve with both of her small hands, and she pulled, and she looked up at him, and she said it. "They're beating my mama. She's dying. Please, mister. Please." The entire restaurant had gone quiet. Gavin looked at the girl. Then he looked at his men who were hovering 3 feet away, waiting for a signal. Then he looked back at the girl. Something in his chest that he had not used in a very long time moved. "Sit down," he said. His men looked at each other. "Not you," Gavin said to them. He looked at the girl. "You, sit down." She climbed into the booth across from him without letting go of his sleeve. She had to reach across the table to keep holding it, and she did, her small hand wrapped around the fabric of his jacket, as if she was afraid that if she let go, he would disappear. "What's your name?" Gavin said. "Lily." Her voice was shaking so hard the word barely made it out. "Lily." He said her name back to her the way you say a name when you want a person to know you heard it. "How old are you?" "7. "Where do you live?" "Paulina Street, the apartment above the flower shop." "That's my mama's shop." Her chin was trembling. "Please, mister." They were hitting her. There was a lot of blood. "She told me to run and get help, and I didn't know where to go, and I saw the lights, and I—" "Lily." His voice was quiet. Not soft. Gavin Carlisle did not do soft, but it was the kind of quiet that meant, "Stop, I'm listening, I'm here." "How long ago?" "I don't know." She shook her head. Her whole body was shaking. "Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe more. I ran a long way." Gavin looked at Dom, who was standing just behind the girl's shoulder. A single look. The kind of look that Dom had been reading for 15 years. Dom was already on his phone before Gavin looked back at Lily. "You said men," Gavin said. "How many?" "2. She held up 2 fingers and seemed to feel stupid about it and put her hand down. "They came to the shop before. They always come. Mama always gives them money, but this time she said she didn't have it, and they—" She stopped. Her mouth pressed together, and she breathed hard through her nose, trying to hold herself together. "They started hitting her, and she fell down, and she wasn't getting up." Sal had gone very still across the table. He was watching Gavin with an expression that was half caution and half something older, something that looked like he was watching a version of his boss he had not seen in a long time. "Which street?" Gavin said. "Paulina, between Addison and Fletcher. The shop has a yellow sign, Hernandez Flowers." Hernandez, the name landed in Gavin's mind, and he turned it over. The South Side had been fighting over 3 blocks of Paulina Street for 6 months. 2 crews, both convinced the territory was theirs, both collecting from the same businesses, both pretending they were the only ones doing it. Gavin knew about it because it was the kind of chaos that eventually became his problem, whether he made it his problem or not. He had been letting it play out. He understood now that he had been wrong to do that. "Lily," he said, "I need you to do something for me." She looked at him, still holding his sleeve, still shaking. "I need you to stay here with my friend Dom." He nodded toward Dom, who materialized at the edge of the table with an expression that said he would absolutely, without question, stand next to this child for as long as required. He's going to get you something to eat and something to drink, and he's going to make sure nothing happens to you. Can you do that? Are you going to help my mama? The question was direct and simple and completely without armor. It was the question of someone who had run out of the ability to protect herself from the answer. Gavin looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. He said it the way he said everything, without decoration, without reassurance, without the padding that people put around words when they're not sure they mean them. He said it the way you say something when it is simply true. Lily looked at him. Her hands slowly released his sleeve. Okay, she whispered. Gavin was already standing. He looked at Sal, who raised both hands in the universal gesture of, I am not involved and I will be here when you get back. And also, please don't forget we still have business. Gavin moved around the table and Dom stepped into place beside him, and two other men, Richie and a newer one called Price, fell in without being told. They were out the door in under a minute. In the car, Gavin said nothing for the first 2 blocks. Marco drove. Richie had his phone out. Price was checking something under his jacket that Gavin didn't need to ask about. Then Gavin said, I want them alive. Price looked up. Whoever's at that apartment, Gavin said, I want them breathing when we leave. Understood. Understood, Richie said. Marco pushed the car faster. It took 11 minutes to get to Paulina Street. In those 11 minutes, Gavin sat in the back seat and he thought about a lot of things he usually worked hard not to think about. He thought about a flower shop with a yellow sign. He thought about a woman who had told her daughter to run and get help. He thought about what kind of woman does that, looks at the worst moment of her life and thinks first about her child's safety, not her own. He thought about what it meant that the child had run into his restaurant. Of all the doors on all the streets between Paulina and Halstead, she had run through his. He did not think of it as an accident. He was not a religious man. He had done too many things to be a religious man. But there were moments, rare, surgical, unmistakable, when the world seemed to arrange itself in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like instruction. Like something was saying here, this one, now. Marco slowed the car as they turned onto Paulina. The flower shop had a yellow sign the way Lily had said. One of the shop windows was broken. Light came through from inside and from the second floor above it, unsteady and flickering, like something had been knocked over. Gavin's men were out of the car before it fully stopped. Back door, Gavin said to Price. Price went left. Richie went to the front of the building. Gavin went to the door that connected the shop to the apartment staircase, the one on the side of the building half hidden by a rusted bike rack because he knew buildings like this one. He had grown up in buildings like this one. The door was unlocked. More than unlocked, it was standing open. Someone had been in a hurry and hadn't cared about covering their exit. Gavin went up the stairs. He heard the voices before he reached the top. 2 of them male, speaking in low-heated tones, the kind of conversation people have when they're deciding whether they've gone too far and trying to agree on a story. She wasn't supposed to. I know, but she came at Carlos. She's a florist, Miguel. She's maybe 110 pounds. She grabbed a vase. She grabbed a vase because you walked in there acting like... Gavin opened the door. The 2 men turned. They were young. That was the first thing Gavin registered. Not the weapons at their belts, not the blood on one of their shirt sleeves, not the overturned furniture and the broken glass and all the evidence of what had happened in this room. The youth. One of them maybe 25, the other even younger. Old enough to know better. Young enough to have convinced themselves they didn't have to. The one called Miguel went for his waistband. Don't, Gavin said. The word landed in the room like something physical. Miguel's hand stopped. Gavin looked at them both. Then he looked at the floor beyond them, at the woman who was lying against the base of the kitchen counter with a dish towel pressed against the side of her face. She was conscious. Barely. Her eyes were open and she was looking at him with an expression that was equal parts terror and confusion because she did not know who he was. And in this neighborhood at this hour, a man you don't know appearing in your apartment was not usually good news. Mrs. Hernandez, Gavin said, not looking away from the 2 men. My name is Gavin Carlisle. Your daughter came to find she's safe. She's being looked after. The sound that came from Elena Hernandez then was not crying exactly. It was something that happened before crying, the release of a pressure so enormous that the body doesn't have an appropriate response for it. A single broken exhale, and then her hand pressed harder against her face and she closed her eyes. Lily, yeah, she said. She's safe, Gavin said again. He finally looked at the two young men, Carlos and Miguel. He could see in their faces the exact moment when they understood who they had accidentally involved themselves with. It moved across their features like weather. First confusion, then recognition, then something very close to pure, unfiltered dread. You know who I am, Gavin said. It wasn't a question. Neither of them spoke. Good, Gavin said. Then I won't have to explain anything. Put your weapons on the table. Carlos moved first. Slowly, two fingers the weapon placed on the table with the careful precision of a man who wants it to be very clear he is not making any sudden movements. Miguel followed. Gavin looked at Richie, who had come in through the front and was now standing behind the two men. Take them downstairs. Wait for me. Richie nodded. The two young men were moved toward the door without ceremony or aggression, just efficiently, the way you move something from one place to another. When they were gone, Gavin crossed to Lily Hernandez and crouched down to her level. She looked at him. Her face was swollen on the left side, her lips split, one eye beginning to close from the impact. She had been hit more than once. She had not been hit carelessly. Someone had been deliberate about it, which meant this was meant as a message, not just an outburst. That information settled into Gavin's mind and did not leave it. Can you stand it? He said. I think so. She tried. Her arm buckled. Gavin caught her. Without thinking about it, without making a production of it, he simply caught her the way you catch someone who is falling. His hand under her arm steady, and she came up slowly wincing, and he held her until she found her balance. I need a doctor, she said. One's already coming, he said. Dom called ahead. She looked at him. You did that before you even knew. I knew enough, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, where is Lily? She saw everything. I told her to run, and I didn't know if she'd be too scared. She's only 7. She ran, Gavin said. She ran a long way, and she walked into a room full of men who should have terrified her, and she asked for help. He paused. Your daughter is not someone who scares easily. Elena made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. It was impossible to tell. She gets that from her father, she said. God rest him. Gavin said nothing. He looked around the room, overturned chairs, broken vase near the door that had to be what she'd thrown. A little girl's backpack in the corner, purple, with a cartoon character on the front, untouched in the middle of all the chaos as if it had been standing aside and watching. Something about that backpack was the thing that did it. Not the blood, not the young men with their guns, not even the woman leaning against his arm trying to keep herself upright. The backpack, because it meant a child had been here, had been sitting somewhere in this apartment, maybe doing homework, maybe watching TV, maybe just existing in the ordinary, unremarkable way that children exist. And then the world had come apart around her without warning. And she had done the only thing left to do. She had run. Gavin Carlisle stood in Lily Hernandez's apartment with her weight partially leaning against his arm, and he felt something shift inside him. Something old and buried, and that he had spent 30 years covering over with cement and fear and the kind of power that is really just loneliness wearing a different coat. He felt something that was dangerously close to guilt. Not for tonight. Tonight he had come. Tonight he had been in time. For all the nights before this one. For every Elena Hernandez on every Paulina Street who had quietly handed over money she couldn't afford because the alternative was a conversation like the one that had happened here tonight. For every Lily who had been told to run and had nowhere to run to. He had built this city, or at least he had built the part of this city that allowed this to keep happening. He had maintained the order that kept the chaos in its lanes and told himself that was leadership, that was control, that was the cost of doing business in a world that was going to have its darkness one way or another. Standing here now in a small apartment above a flower shop with a yellow sign with a broken woman in a purple backpack and two young men downstairs who had made themselves his problem, Gavin Carlisle was not entirely sure he believed that anymore. The doctor arrived 17 minutes later. Gavin stood in the hallway outside the apartment while Elena was examined, and he stared at the wall and didn't say anything to anyone, and his men had the good sense not to say anything to him. Downstairs, Carlos and Miguel were waiting. That conversation Gavin knew was going to be very important. Not because of the punishment. That part was simple. That part wrote itself. What mattered was the message. Not just to these two. To everyone who fed off this street. To everyone who had looked at Hernandez flowers and seen a monthly payment instead of a person. Gavin had let this go on long enough. He hadn't been paying attention. He had been running an empire, and he had stopped paying attention to what the empire was actually doing to people. One street at a time, one apartment at a time, one child at a time. That was going to change tonight. He pushed off the wall and walked back to the apartment door and knocked once. The doctor opened it. Young, nervous, competent, all the things Gavin required in people on his payroll. She needs x-rays, the doctor said quietly. Her ribs, 2 of them, possibly cracked. The laceration on her face needs stitches. Nothing life-threatening, but she needs to be seen properly tonight. Arrange it, Gavin said. The hospital will have questions. Tell them she fell. Get a private room. He reached into his jacket. Make sure she has everything she needs. Whatever she needs. The doctor looked at the money in his hand and then looked at Gavin and nodded and went back in. Gavin stood in the doorway for a moment. Elena Hernandez was sitting on the edge of her bed, pressing a fresh cloth against her face. She looked up and saw him, and she said quietly, "Thank you." It was 2 words. It was nothing. It was everything. "Don't thank me yet," Gavin said. "The men who did this, they won't come back. I promise you that. And the people they work for won't send anyone else." He paused. "But I need you to trust me for a few hours." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, Chicago kept moving, the way Chicago always did, indifferent and enormous, and full of people living inside small lives. Inside this room, a woman who had spent the last few years quietly surviving looked at a man whose name meant something very specific in this city, and she made a decision. "Okay," she said. Gavin nodded once. He turned and walked down the hallway and down the stairs and out into the street where his men were waiting, and where 2 young men were about to learn that the thing they had done tonight was going to cost them everything they thought they had. Behind him, above the door of a flower shop with a yellow sign, a light was still on. It stayed on all night. The 2 men were sitting on opposite sides of a wooden table in the back room of a building 2 blocks from Paulina Street, a room that smelled like old motor oil and cold concrete, and the specific kind of fear that settles into a place when people have been afraid in it before. Carlos had his hands flat on the table the way someone does when they're trying to show they're not a threat. Miguel had his arms crossed and his jaw set, which was the posture of someone who hadn't yet accepted what kind of situation he was actually in. Gavin pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He looked at Carlos, then at Miguel, then back at Carlos. He had learned a long time ago that silence was the most powerful tool in any room because it forced the other person to fill it, and how they filled it told you everything you needed to know about them. Carlos broke first. "Mr. Carlisle." His voice was careful, controlled. "We didn't know who she was." "Who she was," Gavin repeated. "The woman. We didn't know she had any connection to—" "She doesn't," Gavin said. "She's a florist. She sells flowers on Paulina Street, and she pays her rent, and she raises her daughter by herself." He paused. "She has no connection to me whatsoever." Carlos opened his mouth, closed it. "So that's not actually the point," Gavin said. "Gavin, is it?" Miguel finally uncrossed his arms. "Look, Mr. Carlisle, we were doing our job. Victor Reyes sends us to collect from those businesses every month. It's been going on for a year. She's never had a problem paying before." "She had a problem paying this month," Gavin said. "She said she didn't have it." "And you believed her." Miguel stopped. "A woman who runs a flower shop who has paid every single month for a year without fail tells you she doesn't have the money this month. And instead of asking a single question, why, what happened, is there a problem, you put her on the floor." Gavin's voice hadn't risen at all. It was absolutely, completely level, which somehow made it worse. In front of her 7-year-old daughter. Carlos looked at the table. "Her daughter ran nearly a mile," Gavin said, "barefoot to find help. 7 years old, in the dark." He let that land. He let it sit in the air of the room and take up space. "She walked into my restaurant and she grabbed my arm and she told me her mother was dying." Neither of them said anything. "Now I want you to think very carefully about what that means," Gavin said. "Not for you, I'll get to you. I want you to think about what it means that a child, a 7-year-old girl, has that image burned into her memory for the rest of her life. The image of her mother on the floor. The image of 2 grown men standing over her. He looked at Miguel specifically. That image doesn't wash out. You understand that that's the kind of thing a person carries every day for decades. Miguel looked down. I know, Gavin said, because I've carried a few of them myself. The room was completely silent. Then Gavin leaned back in his chair and shifted his tone, not softer, but different, more businesslike, the way a judge sounds when the sentencing phase of a trial begins. Tell me about Victor Reyes. Carlos looked up. What about him? How many streets is he running collection on? Carlos and Miguel exchanged a glance, the kind of glance that asks a question, is this a test? And if we answer, are we signing something we can't unsign? Gavin watched that exchange happen and didn't intervene. He let them calculate. He already knew the answer to what he'd asked. He wanted to see if they'd tell the truth. 7, Carlos said finally. 7 streets on the south side. Paulina, Dahmen, Marshfield, Winchester, the main commercial blocks. How many people collecting? 15, maybe 20. And Reyes answers to who? Another glance. This one longer. That's not a question with a safe answer, Miguel said. No, Gavin agreed. It isn't, but it's the one I'm asking. Miguel looked at him for a long moment. He was reading Gavin's face the way anyone reads the face of a man holding power over them, looking for the version of the answer that keeps them breathing. Gavin didn't help him find it. He just waited. Dominic Farrell, Miguel said. Gavin nodded slowly, once, like a man confirming something he had already suspected but needed to hear out loud. Dominic Farrell, 43 years old, connected to 3 different city aldermen, had been running operations on the near south side for 5 years through layers of intermediaries so carefully constructed that nobody had ever been able to hand him a single piece of paper that put him in a room with anything that looked like a crime. Gavin had known about Farrell. He had also chosen for reasons that felt considerably less reasonable to him now than they had 6 months ago to let it ride, to keep the peace, to not start a war over territory that wasn't technically his. He had been wrong. All right, Gavin said. He stood up. Carlos and Miguel both went very still, the way people go still when they're not sure what motion means. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call Victor Reyes tonight, and you're going to tell him that Hernandez Flowers is done, no more collections, not this month, not next month, not ever. And every other business on Paulina Street, same thing, done. Carlos stared at him. Mr. Carlisle, Reyes isn't going to accept that from us. We're nobody to him. He'll think we went soft. You're not calling him as yourselves, Gavin said. You're calling him as my message. The silence that followed that sentence had a different quality than the silences before it. Heavier, more final. You tell him, Gavin continued, that Gavin Carlisle is personally informing him that Paulina Street is no longer his concern. If he wants to discuss it, he knows how to reach me. He paused. He won't want to discuss it. Carlos swallowed. And us? Gavin looked at him. Carlos was 25, maybe 26, with the face of someone who had grown up making decisions from a very short menu of bad options. Gavin had known 100 men who started exactly where Carlos was sitting. Most of them ended in one of 2 places. The difference was usually one decision made at one specific moment when a door was either open or it wasn't. You make that call, Gavin said, and you do it right, and you stay out of my city for 6 months. Not this neighborhood. The city. You leave Chicago. Both of you. He looked at Miguel. You come back in 6 months, you find legitimate work, you leave the Reyes operation entirely. I'll consider the matter settled. He let the alternative go unspoken. Sometimes the thing you don't say is the loudest thing in the room. Miguel looked at Carlos. Carlos looked back. Something passed between them that was older than this room, older than this night, the kind of thing that passes between people who have been in dangerous places together for a long time. Okay, Carlos said. Okay, Miguel echoed. Richie, Gavin said. Richie appeared in the doorway. Boss, Monj, stay with them until the call's made. Then make sure they understand the geography. Understood. Gavin walked out of the room. He was in the car heading back toward the restaurant before he let himself think about what came next. Dominic Farrell was the next step, and the next step was not going to be a phone call or a conversation in a back room. Farrell was political. Farrell had protection. Going after Farrell meant going after the infrastructure around Farrell, which meant planning, which meant time, which meant tonight was only the beginning of something that was going to take weeks to finish properly. But tonight, the bleeding stopped. Tonight, Lily Hernandez would sleep somewhere safe. Tonight, Elena would be in a hospital room with proper care and two of Gavin's men quietly stationed outside her door. That was enough for tonight. He walked back into the Silver Chalice and found Lily exactly where he had left her, in the corner booth where Dom had set her up with a glass of orange juice and a plate of food that she had eaten approximately half of before exhaustion had caught up with her. She was asleep, sitting up her cheek, resting on the folded arms she'd made into a pillow on the table. Her breathing slow and even, the way children sleep when their bodies finally force the decision for them. Dom was sitting across from her, not hovering, not watching, with the tense alertness of a bodyguard just sitting, like a very large, very armed babysitter who had made an unexpected peace with the assignment. Gavin slid into the seat beside her arm. He looked at her sleeping face. The cut above her eyebrow had been cleaned, a small bandage pressed over it. Someone had found her a pair of socks from somewhere. Her bare feet, now covered, were tucked up on the seat beneath her. "She talked for about 10 minutes straight after you left," Dom said quietly. "Just everything. Her mama's shop, her school, a cat named Biscuit that lives in the building, and then she just went out." Gavin looked at the sleeping girl. "Dom," he said without looking up. "Yeah." "When did we stop noticing?" Dom didn't answer right away. He was not a man who answered questions quickly. It was one of the things Gavin trusted about him. He thought before he spoke, which in their line of work was a quality that kept people alive. "I don't know," Dom said finally. "Sometime. A while ago." Gavin nodded. That was honest. He appreciated honest. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. The doctor confirming that Elena was at the hospital, settled into a private room. X-rays done, 2 cracked ribs, confirmed stitches, completed. Comfortable. Asking about her daughter. Gavin typed back, "She's safe. She'll see her in the morning." He put the phone away. Sal materialized from somewhere Gavin had almost forgotten Sal was still there, and slid into the booth on the other side of Dom with the careful energy of a man who has been waiting politely for 2 hours and has decided his patience deserves acknowledgement. "So," Sal said very quietly with one eye on the sleeping child. "So," Gavin said, "Farrell." Gavin looked at him. "You knew it was Farrell's operation." Sal had the decency not to deny it. "I heard some things. I didn't know the specifics." "You knew enough," Gavin said. His voice was still quiet, still controlled, still pointed. "And you didn't bring it to me." Sal shifted in his seat. "Gavin, Farrell has connections to people who have connections to people who are very motivated to keep things exactly as they are. Moving on him isn't simple," Gavin said. Sal blinked. "I know it's not simple," Gavin said. "Nothing worth doing is simple. The question isn't whether it's complicated." He glanced at Lily. "The question is whether it's right." Sal looked at the sleeping girl. Then he looked at Gavin. His expression did something complicated, cycling through several things before settling on something that looked like resignation mixed with a very old loyalty. "What do you need from me?" Sal said. "Everything you know about Farrell's political connections. Specifically which alderman, which city contracts, and what he has on each of them." Gavin paused. "I'm going to need leverage, clean leverage, the kind that doesn't blow back." Sal rubbed the side of his face. "That's going to take a few days. You have until Monday. It's Thursday night." "I know what night it is." Sal sighed, the sigh of a man who has worked for Gavin Carlisle for 20 years and has made a kind of peace with the pace at which this man operates. "Monday," he said. "Thank you," Gavin said. Sal stood up. He looked at Lily one more time. Something crossed his face that might have been something personal, something private. A man with daughters of his own looking at someone else's child sleeping in a booth at midnight and doing the math on what her night had actually been. He didn't say what he was thinking. He just nodded once and walked out. Gavin sat in the quiet of the restaurant. Most of the other diners had gone. The kitchen was dark, the jazz trio long since packed up, and he looked at Lily Hernandez and he thought about the word that had been sitting in the back of his throat since he'd walked up those stairs and found Elena on her kitchen floor. Responsible. He was responsible, not for what Carlos and Miguel had done, that was on them and on Reyes and ultimately on Farrell, but for the ecosystem that allowed it. for the architecture of fear and obligation and strategic silence that let men like Farrell operate in the spaces between things. He had built walls around his own territory and told himself the walls were protection and they were for the people inside them. But walls also had shadows, and people lived in the shadows. He had not been paying attention to the people in the shadows. Lily made a small sound in her sleep. Her hand moved searching for something automatically and found the edge of the table and held it. Even asleep, she was holding on. Gavin reached over slowly and placed his hand near hers on the table. Not touching, just close. The way you set a lamp near someone in the dark without waking them. She settled. His phone buzzed again. He looked at it. Richie call was made. Reyes picked up. Message delivered. He was quiet for a long time and then said, "Understood." No pushback. That was interesting. No pushback meant one of two things. Either Reyes was smart enough to know that arguing with Gavin Carlisle over a flower shop was a losing proposition, or Reyes had already anticipated that this situation was going to surface and had prepared himself for it. The second possibility was more troubling because it implied a level of awareness of Gavin of the situation, maybe of the specific choice to push Lily Hernandez to the point of violence on this particular week that felt less like coincidence the longer Gavin thought about it. He typed back, "Bring it to me in the morning," everything Reyes said, word for word. Then he put his phone down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. There was a version of this that was bigger than a florist on Paulina Street. He hadn't wanted to see it earlier. He was seeing it now. Someone had pushed on Paulina Street specifically. Someone had sent two young men to collect from a woman who had always paid during a week when she happened not to have the money with enough aggression to put her in the hospital. That was not standard collection behavior. That was a message. The question was who the message was for, not Elena. A florist doesn't receive messages from men like Dominic Farrell. Lily Hernandez wasn't the target. The target was the street. The target was the neighborhood. And the neighborhood was right on the edge of the territory that Gavin had spent 3 decades maintaining. Someone was testing the border. Gavin's jaw tightened. He looked at Lily one more time. Her chest rose and fell. Her hand still held the edge of the table. There was a small, dried smear of orange juice at the corner of her mouth from the glass Dom had given her, and it made her look so completely heartbreakingly ordinary, a little girl who had fallen asleep at a table and needed her mother, that Gavin felt something shift inside his chest again, harder this time. He had a daughter. Had. Past tense. She was 23 years old now and lived in San Francisco and hadn't returned his last 4 phone calls, which he deserved, and he knew he deserved it, and he thought about her every single day in the specific, helpless way you think about people you love whom you have failed with your choices. Her name was Nina. She had her mother's eyes. She had his stubbornness. She had gotten out of Chicago at 18 and she had been right to do it. Lily was nothing like Nina. Nina had grown up with everything money could protect a person with. Lily was growing up above a flower shop on a street that people like Gavin controlled like a chessboard. And yet, looking at Lily, he thought about Nina. He thought about them both, and he thought about what it meant to be a child in a world that was indifferent to children, and he thought about the decision he had been running from for years, the decision about what he actually owed to the city he had spent his whole life claiming. Dom leaned forward slightly. "Boss, it's almost 2 in the morning. What do you want to do with her?" Gavin thought for a moment. "The hospital where Elena is, there's a family waiting room on her floor." "Should be. Take Lily there. Tell the nurses her mother is Lily Hernandez's room, whatever the room is. Tell them she needs to be close to her mother." Dom nodded. "You want me to wake her?" Gavin looked at the sleeping girl. "Carry her," he said. Dom stood up from the booth with the careful, deliberate movements of a large man doing something gentle, and he reached across the table and scooped Lily Hernandez up with a kind of ease that seemed impossible for a man his size. She stirred slightly, made a small, confused sound, and Dom said quietly, "You're going to your mama, kid. Go back to sleep." She did. Gavin watched Dom carry her toward the door. One of the other men held it open. The night outside was cold and dark and fully Chicago, the kind of city that ate people for reasons that were nobody's fault and everybody's fault simultaneously. He sat alone in the empty restaurant for a few minutes after they were gone. Then he took out his phone and he found a number he had not called in 7 years. Not because he had forgotten it, he had never forgotten it, But because calling it required a kind of humility that he had not been ready for. He stared at the name on the screen. Nina. He put the phone back in his pocket. Not tonight. There were things that needed to be done before he had the right to make that call. Things he needed to fix, not just for himself, not just for Lily, but for the version of himself that Nina had once believed in, before he'd given her reasons not to. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He walked out of the Silver Chalice and into the Chicago night. And somewhere in the city, Dominic Farrell was asleep and didn't yet know that his name had come up twice in the last 3 hours, in a context that was going to require his full attention very soon. And somewhere 2 blocks away, Victor Reyes was awake and had very likely already picked up his phone to make a call of his own to someone who would want to know what had just happened on Paulina Street. The board was moving. Gavin felt something he had not felt in a long time, a clarity clean and cold, and specific, the kind that only comes when you finally stop negotiating with yourself about what needs to be done. He got in the car. "Where to?" Marco said. "Home," Gavin said. "I need to think." Marco drove. Gavin looked at the city passing outside the window, the storefronts and the streetlights and the ordinary dark windows of ordinary people living ordinary lives inside a system that had been arranged entirely without their input, and he began methodically and quietly to plan. He didn't sleep. That wasn't unusual for Gavin. He had never been a man who slept easily, not in 30 years of running operations that required him to stay 3 steps ahead of people who wanted him dead. But this particular sleeplessness was different from the operational kind. This one had a weight to it, a texture. It sat on his chest like something that had been waiting a long time for permission to make itself known. He was at his desk by 4 in the morning, a glass of water untouched at his elbow, a yellow legal pad in front of him on which he had written 2 words and then stopped Dominic Farrell. He stared at those 2 words for a long time, not because he didn't know what to do about them, but because doing something about them meant acknowledging that he had known about Farrell for 6 months and chosen to do nothing, and that choice had put Lily Hernandez on her kitchen floor and sent a 7-year-old girl running barefoot through Chicago at night. That was on him. He was not going to pretend otherwise. His phone rang at 6:45. He picked it up before the second ring. "It's Dom." The voice was steady, unhurried, which meant nothing serious had shifted in the night. "Elena's stable, slept most of the night according to the nurse. Lily's in the family room on the same floor. She woke up around 5, went to her mother's room, apparently just held her mother's hand and went back to sleep in the chair." Gavin closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. "Good. There's something else." Dom's voice shifted slightly. Not alarm. Dom didn't do alarm, but attention, the kind of tone that meant he was choosing words carefully. "Richie called me an hour ago when he was leaving the building last night after making sure Carlos and Miguel were on their way out of the city. He saw something." "What did he see?" "A car, parked on Paulina, half a block from Elena's building. Dark sedan, engine off, no plates." Gavin's hand tightened on the phone. "How long was it there?" "Richie thinks it was there when we arrived. He didn't flag it at the time because we had other priorities. But it was still there when he left 2 hours later. And the man behind the wheel Richie got a look at him when a streetlight caught the window was not one of ours." Description: a white male, 50s, heavy-build jacket that wasn't cheap. Richie said he had the look of somebody who gets paid to watch things. "Private security," Gavin said. "Or a message," Dom said. "Somebody wanted us to know we were being observed." Gavin was quiet for 3 seconds. "Then pull the surveillance footage from the bodega on the corner of Paulina and Addison. There's a camera facing the street. Whoever owns that car, I want a plate, I want a face, I want it by noon." "Already on it," Dom said. "One more thing." "Go ahead." "Sal called Dawi at 6. He said he started making calls last night after he left the restaurant. Apparently the Farrell situation is bigger than what Miguel told you." "How much bigger?" "He didn't want to say over the phone. He wants to meet this morning." Gavin looked at the legal pad, at the 2 words, "Tell him 10 o'clock. My office." He put the phone down and looked at the window. Chicago was getting light. The city was waking up, starting its engines, making its demands the way it did every morning without apology. He thought about Lily Hernandez waking up in a hospital bed with 2 cracked ribs and a daughter who had spent the night in a chair beside her. He thought about what she would tell Lily this morning. How do you explain last night to a 7-year-old? How do you make it something survivable? He picked up his phone again. He found the number for the hospital, asked for Elena's floor, asked the floor nurse to pass a message when Mrs. Hernandez was awake that her flowers had been watered. It was a small, strange message. He wasn't sure why he chose those words. But when the nurse read it back to him, it sounded right. Sal arrived at 9:58, which was the closest thing to early WoW that Sal Marchetti had managed in 20 years. He came through the office door with a leather folder under his arm and the look of a man who had not slept much, either though, for different reasons than Gavin. He sat down across the desk without being invited, which was also unusual, and opened the folder. Dominic Farrell, he said, is not just running extortion on the South Side. He's been using the collection money to fund 3 city contracts that were awarded to shell companies with his fingerprints all over them. Infrastructure contracts. Roadwork drainage, 1 utility substation. He slid a page across the desk. The contracts total about $11 million. The work gets done badly if at all the city pays the money cycles through the shell companies and comes out clean on the other side. Gavin looked at the page. Which aldermen approved the contracts? Daley's cousin is on the committee that signed off on 2 of them. Gavin looked up. I know, Sal said. That's why I didn't want to say it on the phone. This is bigger than a territorial dispute. Much bigger. Farrell isn't just protecting a collection operation. The collection operation is how he controls the South Side businesses, keeps them afraid, keeps them quiet, makes sure nobody talks to anybody official about anything. Sal tapped the folder. The extortion is a silence mechanism. The real money is the contracts. Gavin sat back in his chair and thought about that for a moment. The architecture of it. The elegance in a thoroughly ugly way of the design. Keep the businesses scared. Keep them paying. Keep them so focused on their own survival that they never look up long enough to see what's being built above their heads using their money. How long has this been running? Gavin said. The contract started 3 years ago. The collection operation on the South Side started about 18 months before that. Farrell spent a year building the infrastructure before he started turning a profit on it. So he's been operating inside my territory for 4.5 years. Sal said nothing. And nobody brought this to me. The silence in the room had a specific quality now, the kind that happens when a truth is present and nobody wants to be the one to fully articulate it. People were afraid, Sal said finally, none of Farrell specifically, of the connections. When a name like Daley's cousin is attached to something, people make a calculation about what the cost of saying something out loud is going to be. And he paused. They made the wrong calculation. Yes, Gavin said, they did. He stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the street below. Ordinary morning, ordinary traffic, a woman walking a dog, a delivery truck blocking half a lane while the driver argued with someone on his phone. The completely unremarkable surface of a city underneath which $11 million had been quietly moving in circles for 3 years. The man in the car on Paulina Street last night, Gavin said. I was going to bring that up, Sal said. I think Farrell sent him. To observe. To send a message. Farrell found out last night that his operation got touched. Reyes called him, had to have called him. And Farrell's response was to park someone on that street to let us know he's aware of what happened. Sal's voice was measured, but there was something underneath it, something that Gavin recognized as concern from a man who very rarely expressed concern. Gavin, Farrell has political cover. If this escalates to a direct confrontation, it's not going to be a direct confrontation, Gavin said. Then what? Gavin turned from the window. I'm going to make it very easy for Dominic Farrell to make the right decision. Sal studied him. And if he makes the wrong one, then I'm going to make it even easier for every politician he's connected to make the right decision. Gavin sat back down. Pull everything. Every name, every contract, every shell company. I want a document that tells the complete story. Clean, clear, sourced. The kind of document that a federal investigator would find interesting. Sal stared at him. You're going to go federal with this. I'm going to create the option, Gavin said. The goal isn't to go to the FBI. The goal is to make sure Farrell knows that the option exists and that my pulling back from it is entirely contingent on his behavior going forward. Mutually assured destruction, Sal said. In the most civil possible sense, Gavin said. Sal was quiet for a moment, then slowly he nodded. I'll need a few days. You have until Monday, you said that yourself. I said Monday for the connections. The full document is more Monday, Sal. Another sigh, the Gavin Carlisle special. Sal picked up his folder. There's one more thing I should tell you, he said. He seemed to debate whether to say it. Then, the reason Farrell pushed on Paulina Street this week specifically, Reyes didn't just send Carlos and Miguel to collect. According to what I heard this morning, Farrell told Reyes to make an example. One of the Paulina Street businesses had a tenant who talked to a city inspector last month about the quality of the drainage work outside his building. The inspector apparently passed the complaint up the chain. Sal paused. The tenant wasn't Lily Hernandez. It was the hardware store 2 doors down. But Farrell's people didn't get the right address. The room went very still. They hit the wrong building, Gavin said. They hit the wrong building, Sal confirmed. Gavin looked at his legal pad, at the 2 words. He thought about Lily Hernandez on her kitchen floor. He thought about Lily running through the dark. He thought about all the weight he had been carrying since last night, the guilt and the resolve and the plan building quietly in the back of his mind, and he thought about the fact that Elena had not even been the intended target, that she had been collateral, a mistake, a wrong turn. That made it worse. Somehow that made it worse. Get out, Gavin said, not unkindly, just with the complete finality of a man who needed 30 seconds of complete silence to process something. Sal got out. Gavin sat alone with the 2 words on the yellow pad and the understanding that a woman and her daughter had been turned upside down, not because they were targeted, not because they owed money, not even because they were in the wrong place, but because a building number was miscommunicated somewhere in a chain of men too casual about violence to double-check their facts. He breathed. Then he picked up his phone and called Dom. I'm going to the hospital, he said. Dom paused. Now, in an hour, find out if Elena is receiving visitors. Another pause. Gavin, she doesn't know what you are. She will by the time I leave, Gavin said. She deserves to know who helped her and why. He paused. And she deserves to decide how she feels about that. Dom didn't argue. That was one of the many things Gavin trusted about him. He arrived at the hospital at 11:20. Dom walked with him as far as the corridor outside Elena's room, then stayed back without being asked. Gavin knocked twice on the open door and waited. Come in, said a voice that was hoarser than it would usually be, but steady. Lily Hernandez was sitting up in the hospital bed, which he took as a good sign, and Lily was in the chair next to her with her legs folded beneath her and a coloring book open on her lap that she had clearly been working on with serious concentration. When she saw Gavin, she went completely still. And then her face did something complicated and enormous, and she uncurled from the chair and crossed the room and wrapped her arms around his waist with the sudden total commitment of a child who has decided something and acted on it before thinking it through. He was not prepared for that. He had spent 30 years being completely prepared for everything. He was not prepared for that. His hand came up slowly and rested on the back of her head. You came back, Lily said into his jacket. I said I would, he said. She let go, stepped back, looked up at him with the direct evaluating gaze of a 7-year-old who has learned to read people faster than most adults do. Is it finished, she said. Are the bad men gone? They're gone, he said. She studied him for one more second. Then she nodded with the gravity of someone accepting a report and went back to her chair and her coloring book. Gavin looked at Elena. Elena was looking at him with an expression that contained several things at once. Gratitude, yes. And underneath the gratitude, something more guarded the expression of a woman who has survived by being smart about people and who was doing the calculation right now of exactly what last night's help was going to cost her. Sit down, she said. He sat in the chair on the other side of the bed from Lily. I looked you up this morning, Elena said. On the television in the room, there was an old news segment. I'm sure there was, he said. They called you the ghost of the South Side. She looked at him evenly. Because nobody can touch you. Reporters like dramatic language, he said. They weren't wrong, though, she said. Were they? He held her gaze. No, he said. They weren't wrong. She was quiet for a moment. On the other side of the bed, Lily was carefully coloring something orange. The scratch of the crayon was the only sound in the room. Why did you help me? Elena said. Your daughter asked me to, he said. Lily asked me for a lot of things, Elena said. I still have to decide if the answer is yes. That's true, he admitted. So why did you say yes? He thought about how to answer that. He had been asking himself the same question since last night, and the honest answer was not simple and not flattering, but he had decided sometime in the early morning hours that Elena Hernandez had earned honesty. Because she looked at me like I was someone who could help, he said. And I realized I had spent a very long time not being that. He paused. And I realized that part of the reason what happened to you was able to happen is me. Not directly, but the way the city works, the things I've maintained and allowed, that's partly on me. Elena was watching him carefully. You're telling me the man who saved my life also helped create the conditions that put me on my floor? Yes, he said. The honesty landed between them. Elena absorbed it without flinching, which told him something about what kind of woman she was. The men who did this, she said, what happened to them? They're out of the city, he said. They won't come back. And the people who sent them, he met her eyes. I'm working on that. It's going to take a few days, but when it's done, nobody on your street is going to pay protection money to anyone ever again. Elena was quiet. She looked at her hands, at the IV in the back of her left hand, at the hospital bracelet on her wrist with her name printed on it in ordinary black letters. Elena Hernandez. Like her name was the most unremarkable thing in the world. Like she was just a woman in a bed, not someone who had survived something, not someone whose daughter had changed the trajectory of a man's entire remaining life. I don't want to owe you anything, she said quietly. I need you to understand that. Whatever you did last night, I'm grateful for it genuinely. But I can't be in your debt. I have a daughter. I have a business. I've worked for 10 years to build something clean, something honest. She looked up at him. I can't trade one kind of fear for another kind. Gavin held her gaze. You don't owe me anything, he said. Not a dollar, not a favor, not a conversation after today if you don't want to have one. He paused. What I did last night was not an investment. It was a correction. She studied him, the kind of studying you do when you want to trust someone and you're trying to find the reason not to. People like you don't just make corrections, she said. There's always something. There's nothing, he said. Except, he stopped. She waited. Except that the people I'm going to deal with regarding what happened to you, they are more organized and more protected than the two men who came to your building. And there may be a few days between now and when it's finished where I need to have someone near your building. Not inside, outside, just a presence, to protect me, she said. To protect you, he said, and to communicate to certain people that you are not someone they should consider a viable option for any further messages. Elena was quiet for a long time, long enough that Lily looked up from her coloring book with the peripheral awareness children have about the emotional temperature of a room and looked at her mother. Elena reached over and touched Lily's hand briefly, without looking at her, a reflex, the automatic signal that said, I'm here, I'm okay. 3 days, Elena said. After 3 days, whoever you have outside, they go away and they don't come back. Agreed, he said. And one other thing, she said. He waited. My shop has been paying 3 different protection fees to 3 different operations for the last 2 years, she said. Her voice was completely level. She was not asking for sympathy. She was stating a fact the way you state a fact when you need it to be part of a record. I have paid in total something close to $14,000 that I did not have. I took out a loan to cover it last March. I am currently behind on that loan. Gavin said nothing. I'm not asking you for money, she said quickly. I want to be very clear about that. What are you asking it? He said. I'm asking you to make sure that whatever you do with the people who ran these operations, she said, the businesses on that street get made whole, not by you. By them, by the people who took the money. She paused. I want it done right. I want it done through the right channels, even if that takes longer. I don't want blood money returned to me. I want accountability. Gavin looked at this woman with 2 cracked ribs and a daughter with a purple backpack in a flower shop with a yellow sign and $14,000 of debt that should never have existed, and he felt something that he couldn't immediately name. Something that was respect and admiration, and something older and more personal that he suspected had to do with Nina, and with his ex-wife, and with all the women who had been in his life and had wanted from him a version of himself that he had never quite managed to produce. "I'll make it happen," he said. She nodded, once. The negotiation was complete. Gavin stood up. He looked at Lily, who had been listening to all of it with the studied casualness of a child pretending very hard to color. "How's the orange?" he said. She looked up. "It's a tiger," she said. "Good choice," he said. He turned to leave, and then he heard her voice again, them all indirect and completely without performance. "Mr. Carlisle?" He turned back. Lily was looking at him straight on. "Do you have any kids?" she said. The question hit him in a specific place that he was not prepared for, not again, not twice in one morning. He looked at her for a moment. "A daughter," he said, "and she's grown up now." "Do you see her a lot?" "No," he said, "not as much as I should." Lily seemed to consider this with the serious moral attention that children bring to the gaps in adult lives. "You should fix that," she said, and then she went back to her tiger. Gavin walked out of the room. He walked down the corridor without saying anything to Dom, who fell into step beside him anyway, reading him correctly and maintaining silence. They were in the elevator before Gavin spoke. "Get me Farrell's home address," he said. Dom looked at him sideways. "Not for that," Gavin said. "I'm going to send him a letter." Dom blinked. A letter. A very specific letter. The kind that a man in his position reads once and then spends a long time thinking about. The elevator opened. They walked through the lobby. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving, breathing. Indifferent, enormous. A taxi nearly sideswiped a bus. Someone on the corner was selling pretzels. Two women walked past talking fast about something that had nothing to do with any of this. Gavin got in the car. "Marco," he said, "I need to make a stop before we go back to the office." "Where?" Marco said. Gavin thought about a coloring book, a tiger in orange, a 7-year-old girl sitting in a hospital room telling him to fix his life with the complete authority of someone who has recently run a mile barefoot in the dark and knows better than most what it means to act on something before it's too late. "There's a stationery store on Michigan Avenue," Gavin said. "The one near the bridge. Pull up outside." Marco glanced in the rearview mirror with the expression of a man who has driven Gavin Carlisle for 12 years and thought he had seen everything. "Yes, boss," Marco said. And Dominic Farrell, still asleep in his house in Lincoln Park with no idea of the machinery that had been set in motion around him overnight, had maybe 72 hours left of believing that what happened on Paulina Street was a minor inconvenience that would resolve itself. It would not resolve itself. It would resolve, but on entirely different terms than Farrell had planned for, because the man writing a letter on expensive stationery in a car outside a shop on Michigan Avenue was no longer the man who looked the other way and called it pragmatism. That man had walked into a hospital room this morning and been told by a 7-year-old to fix his life, and he had decided she was right. The letter took him 40 minutes to write, not because he didn't know what to say, he had known what to say before he walked into the stationery store. It took 40 minutes because he wrote it 4 times. The first version was too aggressive, the second was too measured, too careful, the kind of thing a lawyer writes when a lawyer is trying not to say what he actually means. The third was close, but had one sentence in the middle that felt like a threat, and Gavin had decided specifically that this letter would not contain a single threat. Not one. Because a threat gave Farrell something to react to, something to push against, something to show his people as evidence of being pressured. What Gavin was sending was not a threat. It was a mirror. It was a document that showed Dominic Farrell exactly what he looked like held up in front of his face in such precise, unhurried detail that there would be no question about what was being communicated. The fourth version was right. It was 3 paragraphs. It referenced by name 2 of the shell companies. It referenced by contract number 1 of the infrastructure deals. It referenced without naming him the alderman whose cousin had approved 2 of those contracts. And in the final paragraph, it said simply that the writer of the letter was in possession of documentation that told the complete story of the last 4.5 years, and that this documentation was currently being held by a third party with instructions to act on it under specific circumstances, none of which needed to occur if Mr. Farrell found it within himself to make a few adjustments to his current business model. No signature, no return address. Farrell would know. Gavin sealed the envelope in the car and handed it to Dom with an address in Lincoln Park and instructions to have it hand-delivered before 5 o'clock that afternoon. Dom took the envelope. He He held it for a moment like a man holding something that weighed more than it looked. "This is the opening move," he said. "This is the only move," Gavin said. "Everything else is response." Dom put the envelope in his inside jacket pocket. "And if his response is to come at us directly, then we have a different conversation," Gavin said. "But he won't. Farrell is not a man who uses force when he has options. He got where he is by being smart about which fights to pick. He's going to read that letter, and he's going to make calls, and he's going to spend 24 hours trying to figure out how much I actually know." Gavin looked out the window. "And then he's going to call me." "How do you know he'll call?" "Because the letter doesn't give him a number," Gavin said. "So finding my number becomes his first act of engagement. And the moment he picks up that phone to find me, he's already accepted that we're negotiating." Dom was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time in a long time, something on his face moved toward what might generously be called admiration. "You've been planning this since the restaurant," he said. "I've been planning it since the car ride to Paulina Street," Gavin said. "I just didn't know all the pieces yet." They drove back to the office. The morning moved. Sal delivered 2 more pages of documentation by early afternoon source material on the shell companies that was cleaner and more detailed than Gavin had expected. And Gavin spent an hour on the phone with a man he had not spoken to in 9 years, a former federal prosecutor named Arthur Weiss, who had moved into private practice and who owed Gavin a favor that had never been collected. Gavin did not call in the favor. He simply described in broad terms a hypothetical situation involving municipal contracts and shell companies and asked Arthur what a federal investigator would need to see in order to consider it worth pursuing. Arthur was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the phone. Then he said, "Is this hypothetical?" "For now," Gavin said. "Gavin." Arthur's voice had the careful quality of a man reevaluating a conversation in real time. "If this hypothetical involves people with political connections at the city level, it does. Then a hypothetical federal investigator would want at minimum 2 things: a paper trail connecting the principals to the shell entities, and a witness willing to make a statement." "What kind of witness?" "Someone with direct knowledge, not secondhand, not hearsay, someone who was in the room or who handled the money or who can put a name to a decision." Arthur paused. "That's the hard part usually. The paper exists. Getting someone to stand behind it is another matter." Gavin thanked him and ended the call. He sat back and thought about Carlos and Miguel. Carlos specifically, the one who had been careful with his words in that back room, the one who had answered Gavin's questions with enough precision to suggest he understood exactly what he was involved in and had been uncomfortable about it for a while. Carlos knew Reyes. Carlos had been in rooms where decisions were made. Carlos was 25 years old and had been given a door out of Chicago and taken it, and if that door could be slightly repositioned to also be a door toward something more permanent than just leaving town, he picked up his phone and called Richie. "Carlos," he said. "Where is he?" "Milwaukee," Richie said. "He's at his cousin's. I have the address." "Call him. Don't tell him why. Just tell him I want to talk. Tell him it's an opportunity, not a consequence. He'll be scared." "He should be, Randy," Gavin said. "Tell him to be scared and call me anyway. A man who's scared and still acts is exactly the kind of man I need right now." He put the phone down, looked at the clock, 1:47 in the afternoon. He had been awake for 34 hours. He could feel it in the back of his eyes, in the specific heaviness of his hands, in the way small things were taking slightly longer to process. He had operated in this state before. The trick was to stay ahead of it, to keep moving, to not let the stillness catch up until the work was done. His phone rang, unknown number. He looked at it for one full ring, then he picked up. "Mr. Carlisle?" The voice was even, controlled, educated, the voice of a man who had spent years making himself sound reasonable. "My name is—" "I know who you are," Gavin said. A short silence. Recalibration. "Then you know why I'm calling." "I have a general idea," Gavin said. "You received something this afternoon." "I did." Farrell's voice didn't change, which was itself information most men receiving that letter would have had at least a molecule of heat in their voice by now. Farrell had none, which meant he had been preparing for a call like this for longer than one afternoon, which meant that the letter was not as much of a surprise as Gavin had intended it to be. "I want to meet." "I'm sure you do," Gavin said. "In person. Neutral location. Just the two of us. There is no neutral location in this city, Gavin said. Every room belongs to somebody. Then your choice, Farrell said. Wherever you're comfortable. I want to have a conversation, that's all. A pause. I think we can resolve this in a way that works for both of us. Something about the confidence in that last sentence set off a very quiet alarm in the back of Gavin's mind. Not the words themselves offering a resolution was expected. It was the tone, the absence of any defensiveness, the complete settled certainty of a man who had walked into this conversation knowing something that the other person didn't. Friday, Gavin said, 7 o'clock, the Silver Chalice. On the Silver Chalice, Farrell said. There was something in the repetition that was almost amused. Of course, I'll be there. He hung up. Gavin set the phone down slowly. He turned the conversation over in his mind, emanating it from every angle, the way you examine something that looks right but feels slightly wrong. The speed of the call bothered him. The letter had been delivered less than 3 hours ago. A cautious man, and Farrell was a cautious man, should have spent at least a day processing before making contact. The fact that he'd called within hours said one of two things. Either Farrell was rattled and acting impulsively, which didn't match his profile at all, or Farrell had been anticipating this moment and had a plan ready to execute the moment it arrived. Gavin stood up from his desk and walked to the door. Dom, he said. Dom appeared. The surveillance footage from Paulina Street. Did it come in? Came in an hour ago. Richie has it. Get Richie in here. Richie arrived in 4 minutes with a tablet and the expression of a man who had been waiting to show something. He pulled up the frozen image and turned the screen toward Gavin. The car was clearly visible. Dark sedan parked on Paulina exactly where Richie had seen it. The streetlight had caught the windshield at an angle that gave them a partial but workable view of the driver. Heavy build, 50s, and on the side of the car, partially obscured but readable, if you knew what you were looking for, a parking permit, the kind issued to city contractors. Gavin looked at the permit number. Run that, he said. Richie was already on his phone. 40 seconds passed. Then Richie looked up with the specific expression of someone delivering information that recontextualizes everything. It's registered to a security consulting firm called Meridian Group, he said. Incorporated in Delaware 2 years ago. Listed director is a man named Frank Pastore. Pastor Turner, Dom said quietly. That name, he worked for the city, Gavin said. Inspector General's office, retired 4 years ago. He looked at Dom. He's not working for Farrell. Dom stared at him. Then who? The city permit, Gavin said. He moved back to his desk and sat down. His mind was running fast now, making connections following the thread. Farrell has connections to the alderman, but an inspector general investigator parked on Paulina Street the same night we showed up. He stopped. Someone in the city already knows about the contracts, and they were watching to see who else knew. You think we walked into an active investigation? Dom said. I think it's possible, Gavin said. And if that's true, then the call I received 40 minutes ago from Dominic Farrell, he paused, was not Farrell acting alone. The room was very quiet. He wants to meet, Dom said slowly, in person, to resolve it. To find out what I have, Gavin said, and potentially who I've talked to. You think he knows about Arthur Weiss? I think he might have better intelligence than I assumed, Gavin said. He was not alarmed. He was recalibrating. There was a difference, and maintaining that difference was what had kept him operational for 30 years. Which means the meeting Friday needs to go differently than I planned. He pulled out a new sheet from the legal pad and wrote 3 words. What does Farrell want? Not what Farrell had said he wanted, a resolution terms, a mutual arrangement. What he actually wanted. What the point of a face-to-face conversation with Gavin Carlisle would serve for a man who might be operating with awareness of a federal interest in his activities. He stared at the 3 words, and then something shifted in his thinking, a quiet lateral movement, the kind that only happened when he stopped trying to find the answer and let it find him. Farrell didn't want to resolve the Paulina Street situation. That was a minor thing, a miscommunication, 2 cracked ribs and a scared child and $14,000. Those were details, not strategy. Farrell wanted to know if Gavin Carlisle was going to be a problem or an asset. Because if there was a federal investigation touching the contracts, and if Farrell was aware of it, then Farrell was currently doing what all intelligent people do when they see a storm coming. He was looking for shelter. And Gavin, with his 30-year history of operating below the radar of federal interest with his network, with his ability to make things disappear quietly, was the kind of shelter that a man in Farrell's position might find extremely valuable. Farrell wasn't coming to the meeting to negotiate surrender. He was coming to propose a partnership. Gavin wrote one more word on the pad and underlined it twice no. Carlos called back at 4:15 from Milwaukee, his voice carrying the very specific frequency of a young man who wants to say yes, but hasn't yet convinced himself it's safe. "Mr. Carlisle, Richie said you wanted to talk." "I do," Gavin said. "I told you in that room that what happened with Lily Hernandez was about honor. I meant it. But there's a larger situation here that you have information relevant to, and I want to give you an opportunity that most people in your position don't get." "What kind of opportunity?" "Careful, not hostile, listening. The kind that involves speaking to a private attorney who works with federal investigators," Gavin said, "in a protected capacity. The kind where what you know about Victor Reyes and Dominic Farrell becomes something that works for you instead of against you." A long silence. "I'm not a rat," Carlos said. "No," Gavin said. "You're a 25-year-old man who made the mistake of working for the wrong people and has the chance to not let that be the defining fact of his life." He paused. "I'm not asking you to be a rat. I'm asking you to consider whether the people you've been protecting deserve your protection." Another silence. Longer. "What happened to the woman?" Carlos said. "Elena. What happened to her?" "She's in the hospital," Gavin said. "She'll be home in 2 days. Her daughter is with her." Carlos was quiet for so long that Gavin thought he might have lost the call. Then very quietly, "I knew the address was wrong. When Reyes gave us the building number, I knew it. The shop we were supposed to hit was the hardware store. I saw it when we got there, and I didn't say anything." A pause that carried a significant amount of weight. "I didn't say anything, and then everything happened, and I still didn't say anything." "You're saying something now," Gavin said. Another long pause. "Tell me about the attorney," Carlos said. By 6 o'clock that evening, Gavin had spoken to Arthur Weiss twice more, had a preliminary understanding of what Carlos's cooperation could look like within a protected legal framework, and had received confirmation from Dom that Lily Hernandez had been discharged from the hospital and was back at her apartment above the flower shop at her own insistence, the doctor having strongly suggested another day of observation and Elena having politely and firmly declined. 2 of Gavin's men were outside. 3 days he had promised her. 3 days, and then they were gone. He called the hospital to confirm she had arrived safely. The nurse on duty told him that Mrs. Hernandez had asked the nurse to pass along a message if he called. "The flowers in the waiting room are fake," the nurse read with the cheerful bewilderment of someone delivering a message they don't entirely understand. "She says real ones are better, and she says thank you." Gavin sat with that for a moment. He thought about a woman who had been through what Elena had been through in the last 24 hours, and whose first act upon returning home was to send a message about flowers. About what was real and what wasn't. He thought about the fact that she ran a flower shop, that she had spent 10 years building something that was literally about beauty, about taking living things and arranging them in ways that made people feel something real on important days. Weddings, funerals, apologies, celebrations, every major human moment that required someone to say I love you, or I'm sorry, or I'm here, and not have the words alone be enough. She had been paying $14,000 to protect that. He picked up his phone. He opened the contact labeled Nina. He looked at it for a long time. Longer than he had the night before, because last night he had told himself he needed to earn the right to make the call. He had spent the day trying to do that, to take steps that pointed toward a different version of himself, the document for Farrell, the conversation with Carlos, the promise to Elena. Small things, not enough, never quite enough when measured against 30 years, but real. He pressed call. It rang 4 times. He prepared himself for voicemail, for the particular specific silence of a phone that rings out to a person who is choosing not to answer, and he was already composing in his mind the message he would leave careful and brief and honest when the call connected. "Dad?" Nina's voice, 23 years old, her mother's cadence, his stubbornness, and underneath both of those things, something that was entirely hers, a wariness that he recognized as something he had put there, and a question underneath the wariness that had never fully closed. It's late. It's 6 o'clock, he said. It's late for you to be calling, she said. You don't usually call at 6 o'clock on a Friday. It's Thursday, he said. Dad? A pause. What's going on? He thought about how to answer that. He thought about Lily in the hospital chair telling him to fix it. He thought about Elena's message about real flowers. He thought about what it meant to spend 30 years building something and then spend one night understanding that the thing you built had walls that kept the wrong things out and kept other wrong things in. I met a little girl last night, he said, 7 years old. She came to find me because her mother needed help. Nina was quiet. She reminded me of you, he said, not because she looked like you or sounded like you, because she did the hard thing, the thing that scared her, without knowing if it would work. He stopped. I haven't done that in a long time. More silence on the line, but it was a different kind of silence than the one he'd been getting with the unanswered calls. This one had something alive in it. Are you okay? Nina said. I'm working on it, he said. She let out a breath that might have been a laugh, small and reluctant, the kind that escapes before a person decides whether they're ready to give it. That's not the same as yes. No, he said. It's not. A long pause. He waited. He had learned something this week about waiting, about not filling silences with words that covered things over, about letting the space exist and trusting that what needed to grow in it would grow. But I have a meeting Saturday morning, Nina said finally, but I'm free in the afternoon. He held the phone. If you wanted to call again, she said. Saturday afternoon? I'll call Saturday afternoon, he said. Okay, she said, and then before she hung up, Dad, the little girl, is she all right? She's with her mother, he said. They're both all right. Good, Nina said, and the word had something in it that he recognized as relief, genuine, unguarded, the relief of someone who needed the story to have come out right. That's good. She hung up. Gavin sat in the quiet of his office for a long time after the call ended. The city hummed outside. Marco was in the car downstairs. Dom was in the hallway. The document for Farrell was complete and copied and held by 3 separate people with 3 separate instructions. Carlos was in Milwaukee talking to a lawyer Gavin had arranged by phone in under an hour. Elena and Lily were home above the flower shop with the yellow sign with 2 of his people outside and every protection he could arrange without making it feel like an occupation. Tomorrow was Friday. And Friday at 7 o'clock, Dominic Farrell was going to walk into the Silver Chalice and sit across from Gavin Carlisle and make the case for why they should become partners. And Gavin was going to listen to all of it with the patience of a man who had been in rooms like that his entire adult life. And then he was going to say no, not with force, not with the kind of no that ends in violence or ultimatums or the machinery of consequences grinding into motion. Just no. Clean, honest. The kind of no that a person says when they know exactly what they're willing to be and exactly what they're not. He had been saying yes to the wrong things for 30 years. Saying yes to ease, to pragmatism, to the comfortable logic of leaving well enough alone. Saying yes to the version of himself that kept the peace by turning away from the things that broke it. That version had run its course on a Thursday night when a 7-year-old girl in bare feet had walked past his armed men and grabbed his sleeve and said 6 words that he would carry for the rest of his life. He stood up from his desk and put on his jacket. Marco, he said into the phone, bring the car around. He had one more stop to make before tomorrow. Not business, not strategy. He had passed a florist on Michigan Avenue that morning, a different one from Elena's. One of the expensive kind that keeps its lights on late, and he had looked at the window display without registering it consciously the way you look at things when your mind is somewhere else. He was going to buy flowers. Not for anyone in particular. Not as a message, not as a strategy. Just because Lily Hernandez had spent 10 years insisting that real ones were better, and for once in his life, Gavin Carlisle intended to agree with someone who knew more about something than he did. And tomorrow, Dominic Farrell would come to dinner, and the story of Paulina Street would enter its final chapter. Farrell arrived 7 minutes early. That was the first thing Gavin registered when Dom leaned into the office doorway at 6:53 and said quietly, "He's here." 7 minutes early meant one of 2 things, either nerves or a deliberate choice to reframe the power dynamic by refusing to be the one who waited. Gavin had been in the restaurant since 5:30. He had eaten. He had spoken to Sal, who was seated at a table near the bar with two other men and a perfectly ordinary bottle of wine. He had spoken to Marco, who was outside. He had arranged the room the way he always arranged rooms, not with furniture or lighting, none of which he controlled here, but with people, presence. The quiet geometry of who was where and what that communicated without a word being spoken. He had also placed in the center of the table a manila envelope. He did not go to meet Farrell at the door. He sat in the corner booth, his corner booth, the one with the walls on two sides, and he waited, and Dominic Farrell was brought to him. Farrell was exactly what the name suggested. Solid, well-constructed, the kind of man who had spent years turning himself into something that looked like authority. Good suit, good shoes, the easy posture of someone who had been in rooms like this one and made them work for him. He was 43, which meant he was 8 years younger than Gavin, which meant he had grown up watching men like Gavin and had decided somewhere along the way that the model was worth refining. He sat down across the table. His eyes went immediately to the envelope. He looked at it for exactly 1 second, one controlled, deliberate second, and then he looked at Gavin. "Mr. Carlisle," he said. "Mr. Farrell," Gavin said. "Can I get you something?" "Water," Farrell said. "Thank you." A waiter appeared and disappeared. Farrell settled back in his seat with the relaxed posture of a man who had decided before walking in the door that he was not going to appear rattled, and he was doing a very good job of it. Good enough that Gavin almost believed it. Almost. "The envelope," Farrell said. "In a moment," Gavin said. "Talk to me first." Farrell studied him. "About what?" "About why you're here," Gavin said. "Well, the reason you told yourself on the drive over, the real one." A very short silence. Farrell's jaw moved slightly, something tightening, and then releasing a tell so small that a less experienced reader of rooms might have missed it entirely. "I'm here because a situation developed on Paulina Street that touched both of our interests," Farrell said, "and I believe in resolving situations directly rather than letting them develop into problems." "That's the practiced version," Gavin said pleasantly. "Try again." Farrell looked at him for a moment. Then something shifted, not a full dropping of the mask, but a loosening, a recalibration towards something more honest because he had assessed the room and decided that performance wasn't going to work here. "I'm here because you know about the contracts," he said, "and I want to understand what you intend to do with that information." "That's better," Gavin said. "And the answer is that depends entirely on this conversation." "Then let's have the conversation," Farrell said. Gavin leaned forward slightly. "I want to be very clear about something before we go any further. I am not your partner. I am not your ally. I am not someone you can offer a percentage to and make a problem go away." He held Farrell's gaze. "What I am is a man who has decided that certain things happening in this city are going to stop. Not because of politics, not because of territory, not because of anything strategic. Because a woman got put on her kitchen floor in front of her 7-year-old daughter, and that should not have happened." Farrell was quiet. "Your operation on Paulina Street," Gavin said, "sent 2 men to the wrong building. You know that. The hardware store was the target. Lily Hernandez was a mistake." He paused. "I want to know if the people running your collections understood that when they made the decision to use that level of force." Something crossed Farrell's face. Fast. Gone almost immediately. But Gavin caught it. "What?" Gavin said. Farrell said nothing. "What was that?" Gavin said. Farrell set his water glass down with a careful precision that was at odds with the slight tension that had entered his shoulders. "What do you mean?" "I've been reading faces for 30 years, Gavin said. "Something I said just now landed somewhere you didn't expect it to land." "I want to know where." Farrell looked at him for a long moment. The calculation was visible, not in his expression, which remained controlled, but in the quality of the silence. He was doing math, deciding how much to give, deciding what it cost him to say the next thing versus what it cost him to withhold it. "The instruction Reyes gave to Carlos and Miguel," Farrell said carefully, "was not mine." The room did not change. The conversations around them continued. The soft ambient noise of the restaurant held steady. But at the corner booth, something shifted in the air, with the quiet finality of a door closing in a room you didn't know had a door. "Say that again," Gavin said. "The order to use force on Paulina Street," Farrell said. "I did not give it. Reyes made that call independently. Reyes doesn't make independent calls, Gavin said. You built that operation. Every decision inside it runs through you. Reyes was given latitude on collection methods, Farrell said. I did not specify what that meant. He interpreted it broadly. You're telling me this was freelance, Gavin said flatly. I'm telling you the escalation was not authorized, Farrell said, which means that what happened to that woman was not what he stopped, chose a different word, was not the intended outcome. Gavin sat back in his chair. He looked at Farrell with the particular attention of a man reassessing the architecture of a situation that he thought he had mapped completely. If Farrell was telling the truth in the specific flatness of his delivery, the absence of elaboration suggested the story was not what Gavin had been carrying for 48 hours. Farrell was not a man who had deliberately ordered violence against a woman and her child. He was a man whose operation had grown past the point where he fully controlled every decision inside it. That was almost worse. Not because it made Farrell less responsible, he was entirely responsible, and Gavin had no intention of letting that change the outcome. But because it meant that the thing that had happened to Elena was the product of bureaucratic carelessness as much as deliberate cruelty. She had been hurt not because someone dictated to hurt her, but because someone had been given latitude and had used it sloppily and hadn't bothered to check an address. That was the kind of thing that happened inside systems that had stopped caring about the people in them. Victor Reyes, Gavin said, is no longer employed by me as of this morning, Farrell said. Gavin looked at him. You move fast. When I received your letter yesterday, Farrell said, I made some inquiries. I found out about the address, about what actually happened. He paused. I have daughters, Mr. Carlisle. 2 of them, 8 and 11. His voice remained even, but there was something underneath it now that was human and unguarded in a way that his earlier composure had not been. I am not going to sit here and tell you I've been running a clean operation. We both know what I've been doing, but I did not order a woman to be beaten in front of her child. And when I found out that was what happened, I removed the man responsible. The table was quiet. That's not enough, Gavin said. I know, Farrell said. The contracts, Gavin said. The money. 14 years of businesses on the South Side paying protection so that you could launder infrastructure funds through shell companies and split the profit with 2 aldermen who should be sitting in a federal courtroom. He held Farrell's gaze. That's not a personnel issue. That can't be fixed by firing Victor Reyes. No, Farrell said, it can't. So what are you offering? Gavin said. Farrell reached into his jacket. He placed a folded document on the table next to the manila envelope. That is a complete accounting, he said. Every shell company, every contract, every individual who received funds. Names, amounts, dates. He looked at Gavin, including the alderman. Gavin did not touch the document. Why are you giving me this? Because you already have most of it, Farrell said. And because I am aware that there is an active federal interest in at least 2 of the contracts. He paused. I have been aware of it for 3 weeks. There it was, the thing that Gavin had suspected since the surveillance car on Paulina Street, since the city contractor permit, since the speed of Farrell's call. He had not been reacting to Gavin's letter. He had been reacting to something that was already in motion before the letter arrived. You're not here to negotiate with me, Gavin said slowly. You're already negotiating with someone else. Farrell said nothing, which was the same as yes. Federal, Gavin said. Still nothing. You're cooperating, Gavin said. You've been cooperating for 3 weeks. The document in my letter didn't scare you because you already handed them more than I had. He sat forward. You came here tonight because you need to know if I'm going to disrupt the arrangement you have already made. Farrell met his eyes. The investigation is targeting the alderman, he said quietly. Not me, not primarily. I am he chose the word carefully, a participant in the process. In exchange for cooperation, I have certain protections, but those protections are contingent on the process being uninterrupted. He paused. If a parallel action from your end creates noise surfaces, things in a way that's outside the federal process, it could compromise the evidentiary chain and allow the primary targets to walk. The full picture was assembled now. Gavin saw it completely all at once, the way you see a pattern the moment the last piece drops into place. Farrell had been building an exit for 3 weeks. He had already made his deal. He had come to the Silver Chalice not to offer a partnership, not to threaten or negotiate, but to ask Gavin Carlisle to stand down, to do nothing, to let the federal process run and trust that it would reach the right conclusion without his interference. And the strange, specific, unwelcome thing about it was that the request was probably correct. Gavin said nothing for a long time. "The business is on Polina Street," he said finally. "Lily Hernandez. The $14,000 she paid. The loan she took out." He held Farrell's gaze. "That gets made right, not eventually, not through some civil process that takes 3 years. It gets made right in the next 30 days. All of them. Every business on that street that paid into your operation. Full restitution." Farrell nodded. "Agreed. And it comes from you directly, personally, not through a lawyer, not through a third party. You find a mechanism that puts that money back into those people's hands, and you do it in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're receiving charity from the man who stole from them." Farrell was quiet for a moment. "That's more complicated." "I didn't ask if it was complicated," Gavin said. Another pause. Then, "Agreed. And Reyes," Gavin said, "he doesn't just lose the job, he faces something real. I don't care how you arrange it. I don't care if it's through the federal process or some other mechanism, but Victor Reyes does not walk away from what he authorized on Paulina Street." "That I can promise you," Farrell said, and something in his voice on those words was hard, in a way that the rest of the conversation hadn't been something that said this was not magnanimity or strategy, but something closer to genuine accountability, the kind that a man arrives at when he is standing at the edge of losing everything and realizes that some things are not negotiable, even in the calculus of self-preservation. Gavin looked at the manila envelope in the center of the table. He picked it up. He held it for a moment. Then he held it out across the table to Farrell. Farrell looked at it, looked at Gavin. "What's in it?" "The same documentation you brought me," Gavin said. "More or less." He held it steady. "Keep it. Give it to whoever you are working with. Consider it a contribution to the process." Farrell took the envelope. "We're done," Gavin said. "You should go." Farrell stood up. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He looked at Gavin one more time with an expression that contained beneath all the layers of strategy and self-interest and calculated cooperation, something that was almost stripped down enough to be genuine. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm sorry about what happened to that woman." "Tell her," Gavin said. "Not me." Farrell held his gaze for one more moment. Then he walked out of the Silver Chalice and into the Chicago night, and Gavin watched him go, and Sal appeared at the table 30 seconds later and sat down and looked at the empty seat across from Gavin and the empty space where the envelope had been. "Well," Sal said. "Well," Gavin said. "How do you feel?" Gavin thought about that. "Like I've been carrying something for 30 years and I just set it down," he said. "And I'm not sure yet if that's relief or just the shock of the weight being gone." Sal looked at him. "Are you going to play all right?" "I think so," Gavin said. "For the first time in a while, I actually think so." He called Elena the next morning. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been awake, which meant the flower shop was probably already open or being prepared to open, because that was the kind of woman. She was the kind who got out of a hospital bed a day early and went home and the next morning opened her shop because the world did not stop requiring flowers simply because you had been knocked down in it. "How are the ribs?" he said. "Manageable," she said. "How is your conscience?" He almost laughed. "Getting there," he said. "I have something to tell you." He told her about Farrell, about the restitution, about the 30 days. He told her in plain terms, no elaboration, no framing, just the facts, the way she had given him facts in the hospital directly with the respect of someone who assumes the other person can handle the truth. When he finished, Elena was quiet for a moment. $14,000, she said. "And the rest," he said, "I'll make sure it happens." Another pause. "Mr. Carlisle," she said, and her voice had something in it that he recognized as the specific, careful warmth of a woman who has decided to say something honest and has chosen her words precisely. "Whatever you were before this week, and I'm not interested in the details, I think you are trying to be something different now. And I think that matters. Not to me specifically. To you." A pause. "Lily asked about you this morning." He felt something in his chest move. "What did she ask?" "She asked if you were coming back," Elena said. "I told her I didn't know." He looked at his desk, at the legal pad, at the two words that had started all of this, and at all the other words that had followed them over 4 days. The decisions and the calls and the documents and the conversations. The slow, imperfect, entirely insufficient, but nonetheless real work of a man trying to become something better than what he had been. "I'd like to," he said, "if that's all right." Elena considered this with the same measured seriousness she had brought to every exchange they had had. "Lily gets out of school at 3:15, she said. "On Tuesdays and Thursdays, we're usually in the shop until 5. She likes to arrange the sunflowers." A pause. "She would probably want to show you how." "I'll be there Thursday," he said. He called Nina on Saturday afternoon exactly as he had promised. She picked up on the first ring. They talked for 47 minutes, which was longer than they had spoken in 4 years, and it was not easy and it was not resolved. There were things between them that a 47-minute phone call could not fix, and both of them knew it. But it was honest, and it was a beginning. And at the end of it, Nina said, "Same time next week." And Gavin said yes. 3 weeks later, a federal indictment was unsealed, naming 2 Chicago-owned aldermen and 4 associates in a municipal contract fraud case totaling nearly $14 million. Victor Reyes was named in a separate filing. Dominic Farrell was not named. The story ran on the front page of the Tribune for 2 days and then migrated to the inside pages and then was replaced by the next thing that the city required its attention for, because that was how cities worked and always had. On Paulina Street, an envelope arrived at Hernandez Flowers on a Tuesday morning. Elena opened it at the counter with Lily watching from a stool nearby. Inside was a check and a handwritten note that said only what was taken. No signature. The amount was accurate to the dollar. Elena stood at the counter for a long moment. Then she folded the check carefully and put it in the register drawer and looked at her daughter. "Mama, what is it?" Lily said. "Something that was owed," Elena said. "Something that finally came back." Lily accepted this with the practical wisdom of a child who has already learned more than most adults about what it means for the world to take something and what it means, the rarer and more remarkable thing, for the world to give it back. That Thursday at 4 o'clock, Gavin Carlisle walked through the door of Hernandez Flowers for the first time as something other than a man responding to a crisis. He wore a jacket that was slightly less formal than his usual. He came alone, no Dom, no Marco, no geometry of bodies arranged around him to communicate power. He came the way a person comes to a place they want to simply be, in caring nothing but himself. Lily was at the work table in the back arranging sunflowers with the focused intensity of a professional, and when she looked up and saw him, her face did what faces do when a person arrives that you wanted to arrive but weren't entirely sure would a quick, unguarded brightness there and then managed, because 7-year-olds also have their dignity. "You came on Thursday," she said. "I said I would," he said. She considered this. Then she held out a sunflower. "Do you know how to cut the stems?" she said. "No," he said honestly. "I'll show you," she said. And Gavin Carlisle, who had run the south side of Chicago for 30 years, through fear and force and the strategic architecture of power, pulled up a stool at a work table in a flower shop on Paulina Street and learned how to cut the stems at the right angle so the water could reach all the way up to the flower and keep it alive longer, taught by a 7-year-old girl who had once run barefoot through the dark and changed everything. Some doors open because you break them down. Some open because a small hand reaches up and knocks, and you are finally, after all this time, quiet enough to hear it. Gavin heard it, and for the first time in 30 years, he walked through.